Hello, John here. In this peaceful place on Mount Royal, right by Beaver Lake, seems like the perfect place to discuss anger, something that is not particularly great subject. When I think back to the things that I most regret, the things that I've said and done that fill me with shame and regret when I think about them, almost all of them happened when I was really angry. Like when I said something, I did something when I was very, very angry. Anger makes us stupid. It makes us do things we normally wouldn't do. So obviously, if you want to live a good life, if you want to live a happy life, if you want to live a sort of a philosophical life, you've got to find a way to get a hold over your capacity for anger. Right. Now, if you're going to do that, first of all, you have to make sure you have the right language to actually talk about it. Right. And there we run into some problems right away, because there's some metaphors that we use that to talk about anger and how to manage anger that are highly misleading. Now, obviously, to talk about something like anger, we always need to reach for metaphors. That's inevitable. That's the way concepts work. That's how language works. So there's no way to get past that, but we can have metaphors that are more or less accurate, more or less helpful or misleading. Now, generally speaking, when we look for our language to talk about the human mind and human emotions like anger, we tend to do, we've always done this, we tend to reach for metaphors to whatever is the main kind of mode of production at the time, or the most important machine of the time. So in ancient South Asia, when the Buddha was trying to figure out how to describe the mind, he said, well, the mind is like a rider on an elephant, right? And that's a really, now that's a very helpful metaphor, right? Because he's saying that the rational part of your mind, the logical, reasonable part of your mind is like this human rider on a giant elephant. So the elephant is all the rest, the subconscious, the drives, the passions, right, all these things. And so if the elephant wants something really badly, like if the elephant wants to go get a drink from Beaver Lake, and you as the rider are in a rush and you want the elephant to skip Beaver Lake and go to where you're going, no. The elephant is going to take a break and go and get some water, and they are much more powerful than the rider. Right? So that's a useful metaphor. Then Plato, later on, when he's looking for ways to talk about the mind, he has this image of like a charioteer with like two horses. Right. So once again, he's reaching for this is a world that is surrounded by lots of domesticated animals. They use horses, right? They use elephants, they use, oxen and all this stuff, right? And then today, when we're trying to talk about the mind, we tend to reach for computer metaphors, and we say that the mind is like a computer, a really sophisticated computer, and we do all these things. Now, that is that's not the best metaphor. There's a lot of problems with that metaphor, but that's another subject for another day. Today, what I want to talk about is that just when psychology was getting its start in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, this was at a time when steam power was very, very important. Steam power was running the factories. It's what was running the steam engines that were in the trains, on the railroad. It was all the ships were running on steam power. And if you know anything about steam engines, right? Steam engines, a big problem with them, right from the beginning, always was a problem, was that they work on kind of the boiling the water creating the steam. It expands, and then that can move pistons and do other things, give you the power. However, if the steam inside the engine or inside builds up too much, it can explode. And this happened with some regularity, where steam engines would explode inside a train or a factory or a ship. And a factory, it just killed like lots and lots of people. It was a really violent, horrible explosion. So eventually what they did is they put in these pressure release valves inside all of these steam engines, right? And you can see kind of a miniature version of this if you look at your kettle, right, that you put on your stove to boil water. If you look at it carefully, you'll notice there's a tab on the back, right? And that is a pressure release valve. If the pressure within that kettle gets above a certain amount, that little thing is going to pop out, and it's going to let out the excess steam so that it doesn't explode and rip half your face off and kill your grandmother, whatever. So this was the kind of most important machine of the time when Freud was thinking about reconceptualizing the human mind and founding modern psychology. And so what he brought back this old kind of catharsis idea from ancient Greece, the idea that things like anger or kind of sexuality, any kind of like that, there are these emotions and these energies, these passions, and they build up within you. If they're not given like a way to get out, right? If you can't sort of all sorts of metaphors came from this. Like, for instance, for a while, especially in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was this prevailing belief that guys were supposed to sow their wild oats, or that you were supposed to get all this stuff out of you're supposed to go and like mess around like crazy and get all that out of your system, and then that way you could settle down later on. In fact, well, that didn't actually work out most of the time. But also when it came to anger, this was the idea that you have to express your feelings and you have to get the anger out, right? And that if you get it out, then you'll be sort of purified and you'll be more calm, right? This very much took off in the 1950s and 1960s. There are a number of books like, Eros and Civilization, Marcuse. I'm not going to go through all the literature on it, but a lot of these books came out that built what we now think of as the sort of therapeutic culture, right, in the West, which then has been exported to pretty much everywhere. And what the therapeutic culture did was to sort of overturn the old, let's say, kind of stoic way of being, where you were supposed to kind of repress your anger, and you were supposed to repress a lot of these potentially antisocial emotions and keep calm as much as possible. They said, no, that's a terrible way to be. That's part of this cowboy mentality, strong, silent type. And they said, no, this is like a really bad idea. You need to express yourself. You need to vent, right? You notice that verb is used very, very often. I want to vent, I want to express, right? Well, it makes sense. And this is, I guess, what is most sad. One of the things that's very sad about this way of thinking about anger is it makes sense, right? But as we know from the last couple hundred years of the history of science, very often a theory that makes sense intuitively and turns out to not be true, right? And then a theory which is more counterintuitive turns out to actually be the one that's true, which is why we have to actually test things out rather than just reasoning it through and kind of saying, well, what sounds better in a TED Talk, kind of thing. Anyway, they have tested out the hydraulic model of the mind extensively in the 20th century, and it just isn't true. Expressing anger, getting angry doesn't make you less angry. It doesn't get it out. It makes you more angry, much more angry, right? So I think if we're going to reach for metaphors and analogies, with the full understanding that they're never going to be complete, right? There's always going to be problems with any of these things. But I think a far better analogy than to think of anger as a kind of steam pressure that builds up within you and you need to vent it by punching a punching bag or going and yelling and bitching about like your wife or your husband or your parents or like anything like that, and kind of getting really, really worked up and angry. I think a far better way to think about anger is to think about it being like the musculature system, right? So with muscles, every time you use a muscle, you strengthen it, right? The more you use it, the stronger it becomes, right? And the less you use it, it atrophies, right? So it's what Nassim Nicholas Taleb would call antifragile, right? The muscular system is antifragile. It responds positively to stress, right? To being used, and if it's not used, it doesn't just stay the same, right? Like a rock or something like that just has a tendency to stay the same, right? It actually deteriorates if it's not used. I think that's a very good way to think about anger, right? So every time you resist the urge to give in to anger, to like lose your shit, to like go off on somebody, to, every time you resist the urge to give into anger, you actually, to think about it in terms of a fuse, right? You have like you say some people have very short fuse, some people have a very long fuse, right? Every time you resist the urge to give into anger, your fuse gets just a tiny bit longer, right? Every time you give in to the desire to lose it and get really angry, you shorten your fuse. You're strengthening your anger muscles, so to speak, right? So yeah, I'm gonna have a couple more videos on the subject of anger because, in a class on happiness, getting a hold of your anger is absolutely of key importance if you want to actually live a happy life. Because if you're really angry, it's my wife and I just finished watching the second season of Dirty John on Netflix, and it's all about like the first season, it's all based on like a completely true story. It's about this woman named Betty Broderick, who just, well, I'm not gonna give it all away, but you should go and watch it. But she becomes absolutely consumed by anger, and just you watch how it just warps her entire personality. It poisons her relationship with her children, her relationship with her friends, with her family, with herself. She just gradually becomes, it's like watching somebody descend into a very severe drug addiction. She descends into a kind of addiction to her own anger. And there's anyway, you should definitely check it out. But yeah, we'll have a few more on this, but that's good to start off. Just make sure, don't think about it as a hydraulic steam engine model. That's a non-starter. All right, see you later.